About a year ago, I reviewed the ZimaBoard, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about what I've ended up doing with it. If you've seen the title of the video, then you'll know it's about ransomware. Question: what is the best way to protect yourself from ransomware? Answer: have a backup. If the bad guys say, "I've encrypted your data, pay me to get it back," you really just want to stick your middle finger up, restore your backup, and get on with your life. Of course, there are other types of ransomware like pay me or I'll tell people what I saw, but encrypting your files is the common one. Because backups are your best form of defense, the bad guys will try to destroy them before hitting you with the encryption. If you have a bit of experience under your belt, you know it's not enough to have just one backup. What a lot of people will do is set up 2 tiers of backup. There'll be a local copy that is all about performance. This is the fastest way to restore and probably the cheapest as well, and there will also be an offsite and hopefully offline or otherwise made immutable copy. This could be a cloud service or it could be tape. The point of this tier is it's your backup of last resort. It might not be as readily accessible, it might incur a cost to use, it might not be as up to date. It's almost certainly going to be slower. If something catastrophic happens that wipes out both your live data and your primary backup, this is where you turn to pull yourself out of the fire. This has served people well for decades, until ransomware happened. These days, the most common reason I see people doing a full bare metal recovery is not because of some catastrophic hardware failure. It's because they got ransomwared, and that means there's a good chance their local backup got obliterated as well. So we have this situation where in the most common scenario where you need to get your data back, you don't have your best recovery option available. That's where this comes in, or at least where it comes in for my HomeLab. If you're considering this for business use where your livelihood and the livelihood of your employees is riding on it, please use proper redundant business grade hardware. For a HomeLab though, the ZimaBoard is pretty much perfect. I'm going to explain my setup using this, but I want to focus more on the principles in this video than specific implementation details. These principles will apply just as well to business and enterprise scenarios as they do to my HomeLab. I'm saying the word principles a lot, and that's deliberate, because there are lots of rules and best practices that get thrown about by people, but this is a situation where you're probably going to have to compromise on something. And in order to do that, you need to understand the principles behind the rules rather than just applying them blindly. So what is this ZimaBoard actually doing for me? It's shielding my backups from ransomware. Into its 2 SATA ports, I have plugged 2 chunky hard drives in RAID 1. It comes with a cable to run data and power to one drive, but there's an optional splitter cable that supports 2 drives. In my initial review, I said the splitter cable could only power 2 2.5-inch drives. After some further testing, they now say it's good for 2 3.5-inch drives, and I've been running that just fine. The way I've actually got this set up is I have the ZimaBoard stuffed inside a desktop chassis that holds my HomeLab server, with the drives themselves in the chassis drive cage, so everything's neat and getting proper airflow. I don't recommend setting it up just stacked like this, because these drives are going to get toasty. I'll put links to the ZimaBoard below along with the drive extension cables I've found to keep things all nice and tidily tucked away in the chassis, should you wish to follow suit. What makes this different to a regular backup is that it has been hardened against attack by ransomware. The specific backup software I'm using is Veeam. I really like Veeam. I've used it for many years and it hasn't let me down. The features I'm going to mention are available in the free community edition of Veeam, but other backup software can do this sort of thing as well. In Veeam terminology, this is a hardened repository. They might also refer to it as immutable storage or a virtual air gap. I really like Veeam, but marketing. Hardened? Yes. Immutable? Partially. But virtual air gap? Look, you either have an air gap or you don't have an air gap. There's no such thing as a virtual air gap. Questionable naming aside, let's examine how this protects us and why the ZimaBoard matters. The first rule you'll hear is that a hardened repository should be deployed on a separate physical device, not as a virtual machine on your production infrastructure. This is good advice. The bad guys will target your hypervisor, because if they can get to that, they have control of every system you run on it. It therefore makes sense to physically separate your backups from your hypervisor so they can't take out your backups and your servers in one shot. Like I said, for business use, proper hardware. For HomeLab, cost is going to be a consideration. The ZimaBoard is fairly inexpensive as far as computers go, but electricity is the biggest gotcha. These days it can easily be the largest cost where I live anyway. The ZimaBoard has fairly low power consumption for a device with an x86 processor, which is a requirement for a hardened repository. You can't run this on a Raspberry Pi. It idles at 3.5 watts, and even running Cinebench, it didn't exceed 9.5. Running this for a year, storage excluded, would cost me around £8 or $10 US. Compare that to my desktop, which idles at about 105 watts. The desktop electricity would set me back around £250 or $320 US in 1 year. For just that electricity, I can buy and power a ZimaBoard, buy an extra hard drive, and still save money. For a cost-sensitive home lab, this works, and I do recommend a separate physical device for this. But remember, it's not about rules, it's about principles. The rule will tell you that your hardened repository must be a separate physical device. This will place it outside the budget of some people, so they will deploy a regular unhardened repository instead. The truth is that if you deploy a hardened repository on your virtual infrastructure, you will lose a fair bit of the protection, but not all of it. There are some other ways this protects you beyond just being a separate physical device. So while a virtual hardened repository is not ideal, it is in my opinion still better than a regular unhardened virtual repository. Let's talk about some of the other protections this uses. Firstly, it runs Linux. No, I'm not saying Linux can't get hacked. Some of you think that, you're wrong, sorry. The main Veeam server runs Windows, the hardened repository runs Linux. This does up the difficulty for an attacker because they need a wider set of skills to compromise both operating systems, but that's not the reason it runs Linux. The reason it runs Linux is for the XFS file system. XFS is a particular feature of interest, file system level immutability. With XFS, you can mark a file as immutable and it becomes impossible to change or delete, even if you have permission to do so, even if you're accessing the files as root. Veeam uses this to mark backup files as immutable for a retention period decided by you, and if someone manages to compromise your backup server or somehow gain access to files on your hardened repository, they can't do anything about them. Okay, I need to address the asterisks. This is all true if you can access the Veeam application as an administrator, or if you can remotely access the files in some way, or even if you get non-root access to the repository device itself. But if someone actually gets shell access to your hardened repository as root, nothing can save those files. As root, they could switch off immutability or simply format the disk. That's why earlier I said partial immutability. It's immutable in all of the ways the data should be exposed, but it's not immutable to the level of a tape that's been ejected and stored off-site. Clearly, preventing a root shell in this device is an important objective for your design, so let's go down the rabbit hole of things you need to consider. Separate physical device? We've done that. Firewall enabled and only the absolute minimum number of ports open. What is the absolute minimum number of ports though? Well, the general advice is only those necessary to let your Veeam server save and retrieve its backups. That means no SSH. SSH could be used to attack it. No monitoring ports, that's a potential weakness if a vulnerability is discovered in your monitoring software. This is what Veeam's marketing team means by a virtual air gap. It's not an air gap, it's a firewall. But hang on, if there's no SSH, how do you manage the thing? Well, that is the challenge. How do you install software updates? Even the lowly ping has been used to crash devices with a software vulnerability before, so don't tell me you just don't update it like that's solving the problem. How do you detect hardware failures? How do you know if the thing is crashed or the disk is about to fill with logs? There are interesting ideas about this. The go-to answer is that if you want to log on, you need to physically walk over and sit at the console. Okay, that works for my home lab, I just need to walk into another room. It doesn't work so well if this is in a remote data center though. But if it was using proper enterprise kit, it would have lights out console access like a Dell iDRAC or HP ILO or maybe an IPKVM. Well, no. If you enable that, you may as well enable SSH, because if you can remotely control the physical console, you can do even more damage than you could with an SSH port, and you don't even need to log on to do it. I have heard of people who stick this in a rack with no remote access whatsoever, and then they place a camera in the rack opposite, pointing at it. It is then someone's job to periodically check the camera and see if any fault lights have been illuminated on the hardened repository's diagnostic panel. That's how they monitor it. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but it also might not be the best option for you. At the risk of generalising, IT folks have a tendency to become very purist about things. We'll go to the far end for farting things just to be technically correct, and sometimes lose sight of the original goal. What is the goal here? Is it to build an unhackable backup repository? No. The goal is to maximize the survivability of our primary backup tier, to increase the chances that if we get hit by ransomware, our fastest, most up-to-date backup copy is available to recover from. We can and should compromise where it makes sense. Building the most unhackable repository possible that we ourselves cannot manage might leave us in a position where we cannot restore our data because we are blind to multiple disk failures and the last one dies the moment we hit restore. What is the more likely risk to the availability of our data? We get hacked by a ransomware gang that happens to have a previously unknown zero-day exploit for the Linux SNMP service that we're using to monitor hardware health, and they use that to gain root access to our hardened repository, or a disk fails. You need to be pragmatic and ask yourself these questions. Reducing the attack surface of your hardened repository is an important part of making it hardened, but you can get tunnel vision. Opening ports in your firewall to allow monitoring will increase your attack surface, but there's a difference between opening SSH to allow remote monitoring scripts compared to SNMP, which can't be abused to gain full shell access, or a monitoring agent that only makes outbound connections. You don't need to choose between disabling SSH altogether and opening it up to the entire world. You could enable the service but configure your firewall to only allow access from a specific workstation in your office. This way, gaining access to the repository doesn't require you to get in a car and drive to the data center, but you still need to physically sit at a specific place. I'm not saying this is how I recommend you do it, I'm just giving you an example of how you might come up with a compromise. If you have a managed services provider, you could use them to provide access. If they have a remote management agent and you disable all other access, then an attacker can't get onto the hardened repository from your network. The only access in this case would be via your MSP, which provides a good degree of isolation if your network gets compromised. Now, I work at an MSP and I happen to quite like this as an option, but you also need to consider what happens if your MSP gets breached. That could give an attacker access to both your live systems and your backups without even touching your network. Like I said, there's a rabbit hole you can get lost in if you try to think about every possible scenario. But you don't need to mitigate them all using your hardened repository. You're playing a game of probabilities. It is perfectly acceptable to say, this scenario exists, but it's very unlikely, so I'm going to acknowledge it, but I'm going to take it and put it in this bucket I call nuclear scenarios. If one of those nuclear scenarios happens, I will simply accept that my hardened repository could get taken out, because mitigating this particular risk requires too much of a compromise somewhere else. The purpose of this is to maximize the chances of being able to recover from your primary backup tier. It is not to make your primary backup tier 100% invincible, because you can't, and you don't need to. You can do all the clever isolation and network hardening you want, and then a pipe bursts and fills your hard drives with water. What do you do then? You use your offsite backup of last resort. This doesn't replace it. This beefs up your primary tier and makes it more likely you won't need to use your backup of last resort. But you can't eliminate every scenario, so you've still got to have that. Maybe if your MSP gets compromised, you call that a nuclear scenario. I'd hope your systems are pretty well protected given the privileged position they occupy, so you play the probabilities and you say, right, our MSP is the only way to access a repo. The repo is hardened against access from our network, and if our MSP gets breached, we use the offsite backups. That is an acceptable answer for some people. For others, it won't be. You know your use case, so you assess the various risks appropriately for your scenario. I think hardening your backup repository against attack is something everyone should consider. But always remember the golden rule. A backup is worthless unless you can recover it. Your goal is maximizing the chances of being able to recover quickly, not winning a prize for the most convoluted system of protections. How are you protecting your backup? So let me know in the comments. I haven't yet made a video showing how to set this up, but if you want that, then please let me know. I wanted to get you thinking about this one rather than just following a tutorial that makes all of the decisions for you. But if enough of you want something a bit more hands-on, I can do that now I've said my piece. Check the video description for links, hit the like button when you're down there, and subscribe for the next video. Actually, speaking of the next video, this is it. This is the one you should watch next.